We can now go live to Scotland and speak to the political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail, Michael Blackley. Thanks for joining us, Michael. It's either an auspicious or an inauspicious time to start the SNP conference, but never for the past 13 years or so has it begun in such difficult circumstances. Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, has this other drama going on in terms of his relatives, his mother-in-law in Gaza. Obviously, our sympathy goes to him and his family in these circumstances. But politically, he's in big trouble, isn't he?
Yeah, it's certainly quite a difficult backdrop for Humza Yousaf for his first conference. It was always going to be the case when the by-election was quite close to this first SNP conference. A defeat in that by-election, which always looked pretty inevitable, was going to be quite a difficult thing for him to handle. So yesterday, the debate was about the independence strategy yesterday, and ultimately Humza Yousaf agreed to many of the amendments, many of the things that the people were rebelling on. So he accepted some of what was proposed. He changed course. And I think that's quite interesting because you didn't really see much of that under Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon is actually going to be here today, which could dominate attention today. But Nicola Sturgeon was very unwilling to change track. She made up her mind and sort of stuck to it. So quite interesting that Humza Yousaf is taking a bit of a different strategy.
Yeah, so she intended to use the election, the general election, as a sort of de facto referendum on the issue of independence. He is now saying he won't do that. Presumably that's in the light of the fact the Supreme Court has said, well, you can't have a second referendum, end of. But he is still going to use the election to his campaign chorus, if you like, he will be demanding, calling for a second referendum. Why does he think he can get that, given that the Supreme Court has decided Scotland can't have it?
Well, I don't think it's not decided that there can't be a referendum. The Supreme Court decided that the powers over it were reserved, so it's an issue for Westminster. And ultimately, that's what was agreed yesterday, was that the SNP are going to put the issue of independence front and centre in an election campaign. They clearly think that by having this strategy, they're going to keep pro-independence voters on their side, and that's going to maximise their vote amongst pro-independence voters. However, there is a bit of a risk in it as well, because independence is going to be literally on the ballot paper next to the SNP name and logo. So in most elections, the SNP actually at some point try to appeal to people that maybe aren't in favour of independence, and they sort of say the SNP will stand up for Scotland at Westminster. It's going to be really difficult for them to do that. So effectively, people that support the union probably are not going to vote for the SNP in the upcoming election, and that could be a challenge for them. In terms of the strategy, what they are proposing is that if they win the majority of seats in the majority of Scottish seats in a general election, then they would declare that as a mandate to have an independence referendum. So ultimately, they would then just demand that the UK government allow an independence referendum. Of course, the SNP could win a majority of seats, but actually lose a number of seats compared to what they have at the moment. So the chances of the UK government actually agreeing to that in the event of the SNP losing seats, I think it's pretty unlikely.
I think it's pretty unlikely anyway. That's what I meant, that the Supreme Court has said it's actually within the remit of the Westminster government whether or not Scotland can have a second independence referendum. And of course, every single Westminster government is going to say no. I suspect Labour will say the same if they get in. Banging this drum, they're running out of rope here, aren't they? You know, we're going to get independence, we're going to have a referendum. Well, the Supreme Court says it's the decision of the London government, of the Westminster government, and no Westminster government will ever decide to let Scotland go. So the real question here is, you know, the Scottish National Party stands for the independence of Scotland. It is nowhere near getting that. In fact, it's got no chance of getting it. So what is the point of the Scottish National Party?
Well, the point that they're trying to make is that they are all about independence, so they're going to continue that push. But it does seem like independence is further down the road than it has been for a long time, really, since the aftermath of the independence referendum in 2014. The SNP had a big bounce. They won a lot of additional seats in 2015. They've done fairly well in subsequent elections, but I think there's a lot of concern in the SNP now about what lies ahead in the next general election. There's the potential for quite big losses, and I think that's what we're hearing at SNP conferences. Humza Yousaf desperately trying to put his stamp on the party and trying to move on from that. But as I say, Nicola Sturgeon is going to be here today, and she's going to dominate attention, and it's going to make people pose the question, is Humza Yousaf just a fairly poor tribute act to Nicola Sturgeon, or is he able to be his own man and put his stamp on the party?
So, as you say, Michael, the SNP was not only defeated by Labour in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election, it was absolutely thumped. I mean, it was thrashed. And that must have been a very worrying moment for Yousaf and his party. And Labour have set their sights on potentially 20 seats. And it looks like there may be a surge north of the border by Labour, yet again, to return to their traditional position of dominance up there. So can Yousaf and the SNP hold off this Labour onslaught, or is it inevitable?
I think it's starting to look fairly inevitable that Labour are going to win a lot of seats from the SNP. But it isn't even just Labour. There are a lot of seats where the Conservatives are the main challenger to the SNP, particularly around about the south of Scotland and the northeast of Scotland. And I think you're actually going to see, when it comes to the general election, that there is going to be some tactical voting, perhaps. So in some seats, maybe Conservative voters might lend their vote to Labour if they look most likely to beat the SNP. And I think the same thing will happen in seats where the Conservatives are the challenger. So I think pro-union tactical voting is a real threat for the SNP, because at the moment they look like they could have considerable losses in the general election. And there is no question at all that if pro-union voters start to unite around one candidate in each constituency, then that's going to be even more of a risk to the SNP when it comes to the general election.
As you said, Michael, Nicola Sturgeon is coming back from beyond the grave to attend the conference today, taking all the limelight off Humza Yousaf. I don't know what he thinks about this, but no one will be thinking or talking about him today. They'll all be talking about Nicola Sturgeon. To what extent do members of the SNP hold her responsible for the decline in the party's fortunes? Obviously, no charges, nobody's found guilty of anything yet, but the SNP looks like it's in one hell of a mess about its finances with the extraordinary events we've seen over the past few months. The interviewing of Nicola and her husband by the police, plus the party treasurer. To what extent do members of the SNP hold Ms Sturgeon responsible for this decline?
It's an interesting question, because it actually seems like there isn't a massive amount of scrutiny of Nicola Sturgeon's time as leader from within the SNP. So I don't think there's been that reality check about the fact that there's things that were going wrong. I mean, Humza Yousaf has come in, and one of the first things that he has needed to do has been to reverse quite a lot of the policies that Nicola Sturgeon was pursuing. Things like the deposit return scheme. They had a proposal to crack down on fishing and other activity in coastal waters, and there was a U-turn on that. There's been a whole series of U-turns, which does make you wonder, Was Nicola Sturgeon just not scrutinised enough within the SNP? Did they not challenge the policy? That certainly seems the case that some of the cabinet ministers had a lot less of a say on policy under Nicola Sturgeon. And then, of course, there's the internal issues, the party's finances, there's the ongoing police investigation, but there was also the latest annual account showed that the finances are in a pretty sorry state. There was a big loss, more than £800,000 last year. The donations have dried up and membership numbers are in decline as well. So I think people now are maybe starting to look at some of these issues and think, how on earth did the SNP get into this state from being such a big, active party with a lot of money and a lot of resources to posting losses and having more liabilities than they do assets, according to their latest accounts?
Indeed, but politically, I think Nicola Sturgeon led the SNP down some ill-advised rabbit holes, especially the one populated by trans women who are transferred to women's jails. And we're talking about sex offenders. Remember, what was it, Isla Bryson, who was a double rapist, a convicted double rapist, biological male, of course, now identifying as a woman. Nicola Sturgeon had no hesitation. But she belongs in a women's jail. She had to reverse that decision. I would suggest that's because although a lot of Scottish people tend to be left-leaning, tend to be socially liberal, they're not stupid. And that was a stupid policy. It wasn't sensible. Another reason why I think the people, the members of the SNP, should look to Nicola Sturgeon and say, well, was she all that much cop, really? Perhaps not.
I mean, there is no question that she was a skilled politician, a good political performer. She was good at putting a positive spin on her policies. So, in that sense, perhaps the SNP don't have anyone like her that's able to do that and able to campaign as effectively as her. But the issue that you mentioned there, gender reform, has been tearing the SNP apart for years. There's huge opposition to it from within sections of the SNP, and really that's one of the big divisive issues that's been around in recent years and been a problem for Nicola Sturgeon. And possibly it is when you look back to the way that it was handled. I mean, when that gender reform was progressing through the Scottish Parliament, a lot of the proposed changes to it from opponents, but also from some SNP MSPs, were just dismissed and were ruled out when actually they could have potentially saved the legislation. Now we have the situation where the UK government has blocked it, it's going through the courts, and it might potentially never go ahead. And really you have to wonder, was that a failing on Nicola Sturgeon's part, the failing to listen to concerns and to respond to them? Perhaps it's her fault that her own legislation hasn't progressed.
Indeed. Now let's talk about the important stuff. Scotland, I can't barely believe I'm saying this, have qualified for the Euros in 2024 with 2 matches to spare. What's going on?
It's I don't think I quite believe it, because we had won the 5 games, and I think every Scotland supporter was looking and thinking, surely we're not going to throw this away from here. Even Scotland have to qualify. So there were a few happy faces around here last night, certainly. We were all Spain fans, I think, last night.
Absolutely, and I wish Scotland all the best in the Euros. It's good to have them on board. It doesn't happen very much. Michael Blackley, political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail, thank you very, very much for your